Good evening, everyone. I'm Richard Rand, Associate Director for Collections, and it's my great pleasure to welcome our speaker tonight, Dr. Richard Brettell. Tonight we will hear the second of Dr. Brettell's 3 lectures on the subject of modern beauty. Those of you who attended last Sunday's talk on Manet will know what a treat we have in store tonight. And I remind you that the 3rd lecture will be held Thursday, 2 days from now, at 7 p.m. in this same auditorium. A quick word about these talks. These are the first Getty Museum Distinguished Lectures, a new annual series presented by the most distinguished, hence the name, scholars and critics in the field of art history and visual studies. We are delighted to have Rick Brettell deliver these inaugural lectures. He has chosen to focus his talks on a great painting in our collection, Manet's Jeanne last time, Gauguin's remarkable still life tonight, and Cézanne's Young Italian Woman on Thursday. But this won't always be the pattern. Future speakers may indeed focus on the collection, or they may range as widely into issues and ideas of a more general kind, and all of the lectures will be published. Briefly, I won't go on at length by way of introduction, only to say that Rick Brettell is Professor of Art and Aesthetic Studies at the University of Texas, Dallas, where he is also the founder and director of the Edith O'Donnell Institute of Art History. Rick is among the world's foremost authorities on Impressionism and modern painting. He has served as curator of European paintings at the Art Institute of Chicago and director of the Dallas Museum of Art, and has long been an international museum consultant with projects in Europe, Asia, and the United States. He is a prolific lecturer and writer on all aspects of modern art. And he is one of the great exhibition curators of our time. There are far too many projects to mention here, but I will remind you all of the groundbreaking exhibition that he, along with Scott Schaefer, organized at LACMA for the Olympic summer of 1984, A Day in the Country, Impressionism and the French Landscape. Oh, there are people who remember that show. It was, as I say, a groundbreaking exhibition which presented to the general public a vision of Impressionism that was as intricately tied to the social, political, and economic life of France as it was about pure painting. There was also the great Gauguin retrospective of 1988, which he organized with Françoise Cachin at the Musée d'Orsay, and many exhibitions on the art of Rick's first love, Camille Pissarro, the father of Impressionism. Indeed, Rick is so closely associated with Pissarro's work that he has been unofficially adopted by the Pissarro family as an honorary descendant. So we could not be in better hands. Tonight's lecture is entitled, The Getty Gauguin is Beauty Terrifying. Please join me in welcoming Rick Brettell.
Thank you very much. I'm a little bit afraid of lecturing tonight because I almost know too much about Gauguin because I'm actually working on the Catalogue Raisonné, and I'm working on the Tahitian period, the last 12 years of his life between 1891 and his death in 1903, and I'm so saturated in this material that I was telling Richard and Timothy that they'll have to, bring a cane to get me off the stage. So if I see you all walking out in droves, I won't be upset. I talked last time about a painting that's virtually contentless, that's really about beauty in its most transitory form. This is about a beautiful young woman, a 16-year-old girl in springtime wearing a gorgeous dress, who is essentially caressed by the artist in the act of painting her. No more different painting could exist than this, and it's a painting which is to me terrifyingly beautiful. I'll never forget the first time I saw it, which was in the gallery in Paris of Daniel Malang, from whom the Getty bought the picture. It's a painting that was very well known to Gauguin scholars for many, many years, and what we knew was this. It was only in black and white. It was in collections to which no major scholar had access. It was in no important exhibitions that major scholars had seen. It was known only through a black and white photograph in his own, that he himself pasted into his manuscript, Noa Noa. It's a painting that was a deep and abiding mystery. And in black and white, it has an even more grim power than it does in color. Here at the Getty in its beautiful frame, and I went down to see it. It's just returned from an exhibition in Italy, and it was resting in the crate and then taken out in conservation and will be hung in the next few days when there's time to get it on the wall so that you can see it again. It's a painting that has a really terrifying intensity, but its chromatic richness is amazing. And I remember vividly when I first saw it, I spent almost 2 hours in one of those little spaces at the back of a gallery in Paris. It had green velvet walls like the Durand-Well studio where it was first shown, or gallery where it's first shown. The light was shining on it intensely. Monsieur Malang let me bring in all the books that I wanted to have to look at it, and I just spent time mesmerized by this strangely beautiful dead male head. A picture of such power and such enigma, and yet in a luscious and beautiful setting. Gauguin himself wrote about it when he finished it to his friend Daniel de Montfred in a letter written in June of 1892, the year it was painted. So we know it was painted before, in the first 5 months of 1892. I've just finished a Kanak, or Pacific Islander, head, nicely arranged on white cushion in a palace of my invention, and guarded by women also of my invention. It appeared in November of 1893, a little bit more than maybe 15 months after it was finished, in the first exhibition that was devoted to Gauguin's work on his trip to Tahiti between 1891 and 1893. That is his first trip to the South Seas. He did another one arriving in 1895 and dying there in 1903 of tertiary syphilis, just like Manet. The first review, in fact, the very first review written of the show at the Durand-Well Gallery in Paris is the only one that mentions the painting, and one of the very few reviews of that much reviewed exhibition that does mention individual paintings. And I'm going to read it to you to give you an idea of how it first was taken in by Parisians. It's written by a guy we know very little about. Oh, here, dear, I've done the wrong page. What have I done? Oh, dear. Wait. This is what I get for marking things too quickly. Here we go. It's written by a fellow named Louis Cardon, and it was published on November 10th of 1893, just after the exhibition had opened. Today, at 2 o'clock, opens the exhibition of Gauguin's recent paintings at the Durand-Well Gallery. The artist is highly esteemed by those passionate about art and concerned about his future, and his extremely personal and conscientious works have attracted attention for some years now. Monsieur Gauguin's skill is unquestionable this time around, exhibiting great creativity, and his 50 or so paintings, there were actually 40, on the Rue Lafitte are not without a certain alluring charm, regardless of his guiding aesthetic principles. You can see that he's having a little bit of trouble. Upon entering the exhibition space, the paintings are exhibited in no particular order, and those which stand out through their evocation of random yet captivating visions are his Harvesters, Woman with a Mango, Woman with Flowers, Lemon Picking, and The Royal End, Le Fin Royal, which is the title in French, translated by Gauguin from Arii Matamoe of this picture. We call particular attention to Ave Maria, which I'll show you a little bit later, with its intense yet delicate tones and profound emotional strength, a work which no artist or even expert in color juxtapositions could ignore. Monsieur Gauguin is extremely skilled as a colorist. His palette embraces the luster of precious gems, suggesting the glaze of enamels and earthenware, and his draftsmanship is of unrivaled magnitude. In the absence of their father, the Duranwell sons took on the task of organizing this remarkable exhibition, refurbishing and newly redecorating the interior space for this event. We offer them our sincere congratulations and affirm that they have upheld their family's extraordinary legacy. So that's the beginning of our knowledge of this picture. And it's a picture which is unique in the paintings of the first trip, in its focus upon a still life with a human element, and indeed with an evocation of interior space, which Gauguin tells us is a palace, and of its inclusion of many other subsidiary figures and forms within it. The head, no matter how powerful and how strange that it is in a setting which is so complex and so mysterious and so fascinating that it vies with the head for our attention. In order to get a sense of the complexity of Gauguin's paintings and his working methods, I'm going to actually deconstruct a little bit another painting to give you an idea of the multiplicity of Gauguin's thinking and the way his visual thinking was very elliptical and very strange. This is a painting which was in the Cohn collection, and it's now in the Baltimore Museum of Art. The title is on it. It's up here. It's called Opa Opa Schnecklud. Got it? And it's signed Gauguin, and it's Opa Opa Schnecklud is the title of this painting, and you think, well, now, how does this help us? You know, what are we to learn from this? And the first thing one thinks about is Opa Opa, and so one looks throughout Gauguin's oeuvre and throughout Polynesian culture for the Opa Opa, which is an intensely erotic dance performed at night, which was illegal during the time of the French occupation of Tahiti because of its overt sexual content, and which had to be done at night in secret in places that were inaccessible to French people, and which Gauguin, for obvious reasons, was captivated by, and painted it in this dreadful painting in the Israel Museum on the right. So Opa Opa, so erotic dance, males and females doing all sorts of disgusting things in the firelight with people standing around them, and then you look at this sort of stolid cellist, and you think, Opa Opa Schnecklud, and then you go for Schnecklud. And Schnecklud was in fact a French cellist of Scandinavian origin who was a friend of Gauguin's, and Gauguin owned this photograph of him and used it for the position of the cello and the hands and the body of a cellist who was a great specialist in Beethoven, who formed the first Beethoven string quartet in Paris, who was one of the great specialists in chamber music of the 19th century. And so we have an erotic dance performed at night illegally by Tahitians, and we have this guy who plays the cello in a string quartet with this bizarre name of Schnecklud looking at us. And then we look at the head of the hapless Monsieur Schnecklud, and we realize that he took everything from that photograph except the head. And so who is that figure if it is indeed not Schnecklud? And you look and it looks enormously like this etching made by Gauguin about 4 years before the painting, which represents Mallarmé. So we have Mallarmé, who translates Poe's The Raven. So we see the raven up here. We see Mallarmé with his strange pointed ears, his eyebrows, etc. And you look at this head and you look at this head and you think it's the body of and the cello of Schnecklud and the head of Manet. And then, of Mallarmé, thank you. I'm a little, I had 1.5 glasses of wine, not a smart idea. Sorry. And then we go to this. Now, this is a comparison which is not terribly visually convincing, but it's in fact a painting by Courbet, which was owned by Gauguin's guardian, and Gauguin owned a photograph in black and white of this painting throughout his life, and it's a self-portrait of Courbet as a cellist. So we have Opa Opa, we have Schnecklud, we have Mallarmé, and we have Courbet lying in back of this ambiguous image. And if indeed this is a self-portrait of Courbet, then why can't this be, at least in part, a self-portrait of Gauguin? So one sees this painting has a huge slippage of identity. Is the figure European or Polynesian? The title doesn't help us. Is it Schnecklud? Who is Schnecklud? Why doesn't it look like Schnecklud? Does it relate to Courbet and does it relate to Mallarmé? And the answer is it's all of those things. And the slippage of identity and the slippage of what we used to call influence is part of the essential meaning of this very complex work of art. And so too this. This is a painting that one has to get into very, very slowly to find its terrifying beauty. Now, the most important and first thing that one has to deal with is the whole idea of royalty in Polynesia. And Arii means noble, and Matamoe means sleeping eyes or death. So that's la fin royale, the end of royalty. And so the idea of there having been an age of kings and an age of courts and an age of palaces in this place called Tahiti is something that this painting evokes. And that too has everything to do with Gauguin's own life. For indeed, less than a month after Gauguin arrived in Tahiti in 1891, the king of Tahiti, whose name was Pomaré V, died. And Gauguin was present for the death, and not exactly in the room, but he was involved, at least in his own telling, in the decoration of the funeral room with a queen of the people. And he wrote about this at some length in the first book that he wrote about his trip to Tahiti, called Noa Noa, which means fragrance in Tahiti. And I'm going to read you the passage because it's so fascinating and because it's really not about this guy, but about this guy. This is Pomaré V. Here he is in all of his French finery. He was forced by the French to abdicate in 1880 and given a pension for life. So he was really only on the throne for 12 years before, or 11 years before his death from alcoholism. He was a libertine. He loved being worshipped both by his own people and by the French administration. He lived in this house, which was called a palace. And of course, for Gauguin, this palace couldn't be at all a Tahitian palace. It looked like a European provincial house. And he comes from a long line of kings, the first of whom, Pomaré I, who ruled the Society Islands at the end of the 18th century, you see on the left, and you can see the degradation of the royal line from a pure Tahitian to a man who in his photograph appears to be white, who's wearing European clothing, and who's completely degraded. And this is the man who is entertained. Here he is with his mother and brothers early on in his career, and here we see him being entertained by bare-breasted Tahitian women as if he is a European at this period of time. But let's hear what Gauguin says about King Pomaré. King Pomaré was deathly ill during this time, and any day grief was expected to prevail. A peculiar air, however, gradually overran the city. This is Papeete. The Europeans, whether merchants, civil servants, officers, or soldiers, continued to sing and amuse themselves in the streets, while the natives solemnly maintained a quiet vigil around the palace. In the bay, an unusual amount of activity was taking place. Under the sun, orange sails suddenly dominated the blue ocean, reviving the silvery stir of the reefs. They were inhabitants of neighboring islands who streamed in day after day to witness their king's final moments and France's official reign over their empire. This was predicted by signs from above, for every time a king dies, dismal masses appear on specific mountain slopes at sundown. According to the natives, this was an impending sign of death. Indeed, just as nature had predicted, the king passed and was exposed in his palace in an official admiral's uniform for all to see. A woman who went by the name of Queen Marau was decorating the royal living room with flowers and fabrics. Just as the director of public works asked for my advice in creatively arranging the funerary decor, I directed him to the queen, who with the refined instinct of her Maori race radiated with grace and transformed into a work of art everything she touched. All the Tahitians dressed in black, and for 2 days we sang chants of bereavement, the hymns of the dead. In my mind, I could think of nothing but the Sonata Pathétique. At 6 in the morning on the day of the funeral, we left from the palace. The detachment and its authorities were dressed in black and wore white helmets. He's painting, while the natives sporting their own distinct funerary apparel. All the districts marched and ordered, and each chief carried the French flag. This made the black mass appear even more dismal. We stopped at the district of Arua. There stood an indescribable monument, which I won't show you because it's so horrible, which along with the atmosphere and the vegetation's furnishings made the most horrible contrast. A mass of coral stones held together with cement. The Negro La Cascade, who was the governor, a French African, gave a speech, a common cliche, which an interpreter also translated for the benefit of the Maori, the king's own people. Thereafter, the Protestant pastor gave a sermon. It was after all this that the queen's brother, Tati, was finally able to speak, and with that, the funeral ended. Everyone left, and officials crammed into carriages as return to normalcy set in. With only one less king, everything returned to normal. With him had disappeared the last remnants of their customs and ancient majesty. Along with the king's death, the Maori tradition had also died. Alas, civilization had triumphed, militant, professional, and bureaucratic. Now, when Gauguin gets there, he experiences this event and writes about it and thinks about it in a way which is fundamentally literary and which really has very little to do with what historians know actually happened. He's, in fact, inventing his version of the events, more or less to sort of set the stage for his own disillusionment with the European or the colonial Tahiti that he found. And it was this disillusionment that's expressed very clearly, even in the first works of art he made. Here are two portraits. The one on the left, a famous painting, which is in the Ordrup Guard, which is called Woman with a Flower, one of the pictures mentioned in the review. And it represents what Gauguin himself called a full-blooded Maori, the word that he used to describe the Polynesians. And on the right is in exactly this contemporary, exactly the same size portrait of a woman named Susanna Bainbridge, which is now in the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Brussels, and which is a very unfamous picture, even though it's absolutely fascinating. And it turns out that Susanna Bainbridge was half English and half Tahitian, and that she married a very powerful king of an adjacent island and was the director of court protocol for Pomaré V, and was one of the most powerful women in attempting to explain to Europeans the culture of the ancients of Tahiti. And he represents her, this woman with sort of pasty white skin, who had an enormously high position in court, in a way which is fascinating in comparison with his painting of a full-blooded Maori woman that you see on the left. And this is a Gauguin that was, in fact, the only Gauguin owned by Matisse. Matisse owned this painting for about 6 years, sort of crucial 6 years in his career. And Matisse goes to Tahiti in 1931 to sort of experience the place of Gauguin and to soak up the idea of this first great color painter of modern French art. And this is a painting of a young man who's never been identified. And I finally figured out when I was working on the catalog who he is. He is the son, also a half-breed, of a Frenchman who was a pastry cook and a Polynesian woman who knew both French and Tahitian, and who was the person who taught Gauguin to speak Tahitian. So this idea of full-blooded and half-breeds and people who carry the knowledge of the ancients with them and who have this kind of blended identity. This blended identity was something that was very important for Gauguin the first months that he was there. Here we see this painting almost as a kind of reference to the death of a royal person, the way that it ought to have been, rather than the way that it was. Gauguin excavating by reading and learning and thinking in a way that I'll show you as we go through the lecture, what might have been had there been a monarchy and had the ancient civilization of the Maori and of the Polynesians survived the onslaught of bureaucracy and militancy and competence. Now, the head itself was supposedly by Gauguin, it was evoked in the grain of a piece of wood that he saw. And he writes about this as well. And it's a fascinating story because it's like many stories of artists, beginning with Leonardo, who sees forms in clouds, and many artists find forms in other things. And it's one of the cases that's very much discussed in the brilliant new book on Gauguin by Dario Gamboni, about Gauguin finding things in form. But in fact, the head actually does come from the preserved heads of the Maori that Gauguin had probably seen in the exhibition of 1889 in Paris. There was a case of them in the exhibition of 1889, and none of them look quite right, but if Gauguin had seen one, and here's a particularly gruesome one with the teeth and the lips and the famous tattoos, which his lack, and here are two others. I'm sorry to be so ghoulish, but this is the way it is. Gauguin had these things in his mind, and it was perhaps the wood grain or some kind of pattern in something that he saw that evoked the memories of these heads so that he could paint them. His head is much less gruesome than its sources, largely because he invented it. He invented it both from memory and from these patterns that he saw, and from a kind of necessity in creating a world that had been lost. The eyes are open, and one sees the pupil floating up to the top of the eyes, those wonderful lips and the teeth that are exposed, like in almost all of the surviving real preserved heads from that period of time. But lest we think this work is ghoulish, one needs to think about the history of such images and images of death in European art, because Gauguin was very interested in them, and he was very interested in death. One sees here, they're very common skull still lifes. This one, it's about transience in a different way than the Manet, with a flower that will die, with a skull that is already dead, and with the hourglass that time goes through. Or here, where even the writings of us, here's the quill, and here are the things that we write, and will they last, and will the glass fall off and break, and will the smoke in this little thing finally die, and nothing will remain. These memento mori still lifes are very common in Northern art of the 17th century, and were of great interest to Gauguin, who really didn't do anything any more ghoulish than any of these. Even his friend Cézanne had begun to paint skulls, and in fact Gauguin briefly owned this painting which was then given to Pissarro and then sold by Pissarro's son later on in life. And this is a still life of skulls by Cézanne, which is almost exactly the same date as the severed head by Gauguin. Or this idea of young and old, of the young man and the skull, which is explored both by Frans Hals and by Cézanne in a particularly theatrical painting that I'm going to show in my next lecture as a sort of a cautionary note of where Cézanne shouldn't have gone but went. And here one sees, when you look at this painting and this painting at the same time, it's difficult to accuse Gauguin of being ghoulish. But then there's the head of John the Baptist. And the head of John the Baptist, whether in Caravaggio, whether in Albert Bout's, in this wonderful, which one is more ghoulish? The 15th century painting or the 19th century painting? Or Ribera or Cranach, or this, my favorite, which is Murillo, a painter we associate with sort of sweetness, and this head that's like startlingly alive and lying in this pool of blood in a silver dish with the cross of Saint John the Baptist. And we go forward even to Redon, who is fascinated throughout the 1880s and early part of the 1890s with the severed head, whether of John the Baptist, which it probably clearly is here, or in other kinds of cases, or even in your beautiful recently acquired work, which is clearly based on the head of Saint John the Baptist in this aurea of light recently acquired by the Getty, or here this beautiful head of what's his name? Please help me, Timothy. Who? Orpheus, thanks. I'm having a senior moment. Orpheus with his harp lying there in this sort of field of color by Odilon Redon. And indeed, Gauguin's painting is no more ghoulish or no stranger or more in bad taste than any of these. We look at it now and go back to the letter in our minds, and the letter tells us that he represents this head on a pillow in a palace of my own invention, guarded by women of my own invention. And so let's think a little bit about this. One of the mysteries of the painting is indeed the palace. You know, what does this environment mean and where does it come from? So I'm going to show you a little bit of it. This is a drawing by Gauguin made in 1891, right when he gets there, of two Tahitians. And then this, which is a drawing of an ear spool from the Maori people, which he'd obviously seen either in a book or in some collection. And when you look at this, you see this. Here is the whole form here. And it comes from a little ear spool. He doesn't know quite how to invent this palace because it looks nothing like the palace that he saw, but he finds in native Canuck Maori art forms that suggest to him wall decorations. Or here, the little stool on the side right here, which has definite origins in Maori carving, which Gauguin knew both from photographs and from objects which were collected by friends. Or here, this strange mask-like form down here, which comes from cane heads, Marquesan cane heads, which Gauguin had also observed. So each of these forms, though invented, have sources and can be found. Here is the plate or table, and this is a drawing by Gauguin of one like it, and here's one which in fact I bought in Tahiti the last time I was there, and you can see that they're still made, these kinds of table bowls where one serves things at great ceremonial banquets, in which Gauguin evokes with his wonderful purple table. The rug is a little strange, and all of the forms in it come from Middle Eastern carpets. And Gauguin was fascinated by Middle Eastern carpets, and though he never collected them, had two books quite early on, which are compendiums of patterns. And I show you one where you can see, you can find virtually all the patterns in this part of the carpet. And Gauguin's first alter ego as a writer was a Persian poet, which he translated into French, in which he made up. So the notion of also finding in Persian and Middle Eastern forms his plans and ideas for this palace is something extraordinary. Now, what about the women? The women are also of his invention. Here's one of them, and you see here this figure, and you see here where it comes from. A painting of 1889 called Ondine, or Dans les Vagues, in the Waves, which is at the Cleveland Museum. And another woman, which you see here, comes from this painting, which is in a private museum in Cairo. So you're all going to want to get on the next plane and go and see it in the present day of Cairo. And here is Ondine, and here is Life and Death, and here is this figure of death, which comes from a Peruvian mummy bundle that Gauguin drew from the Trocadero Museum from memories of his own childhood in Peru. You can see the complexities of his imagination as he forms an image. And here are the two paintings together. They're exactly the same size, and it's perfectly possible that they were conceived as one, as a single work of art, because we see them here together and here together in two different works of art by Gauguin. And we see Gauguin reuse the figure over and over in a relief of a year later, and in the background of a self-portrait, where you see her here as if she's in the mirror, a self-portrait which is stained into the fabric so that it looks like the Shroud of Turin, something that Gauguin was deeply fascinated and troubled by, and wanted in his own sort of self-reflection about being a mortal who is trying to find some form of moral life in the world, and his frequent visual allusions to Christ. So when we look at this, we can see that there's a kind of grammar of forms that come from diverse sources, from himself, the figures, and from what he learned about authentic Polynesian culture, though he had to struggle to find it. There is one last couple, the couple that are here, and they're the most interesting figure in the whole thing, because they in fact predict future figures rather than come from past figures. They look forward in his life rather than backward, and they look forward to the whispering pair of figures in the background of this great painting of 1896, or of these two figures speaking to each other, one hooded and one not, in Duvernon-Nu in the Museum of Fine Arts. And here you see them sitting and chatting. Here you see them in the background of the 1896 picture. Here you see them in 1898. And here you see them in 1902, in the penultimate year of Gauguin's life. These figures who speak with each other, one of whom is hooded and the other of whom is not, as if there's a priestess and an acolyte who are speaking to each other in ways, when Gauguin writes about these pairs, that speaking so that we will never understand. And the idea of hearing things that we will never understand goes right back to that passage about the death of Pomara and the death of meaning, the death of original meaning because of colonialism. Now, when one looks at this as a still life, it seems like it might be a really odd still life in the history of Gauguin's career, but it's very important to think that Gauguin's still lifes are just as weird as the rest of his paintings. And I'm going to take you through a little tour of a few still lifes to show you that. This is an early still life, completely. I mean, who in the world but Gauguin would have put this together? This like little glass cruet and this figure of a Chinese woman in front of this a huge effulgent decoration with a green book and a funny little bottle. And then down below it is a Cézanne still life, which was owned by Gauguin, now in the collection of David Rockefeller and a promised gift to the Museum of Modern Art. But you have these two sides of Gauguin's interest in still life. One of them, the idea of the perfect arrangement of forms, both in space and on the surface, and the other as a collection of mysterious objects that have their own emanation. And Gauguin is much more Gauguin than he ever was Cézanne, and one can see that even in this very early still life. This is a still life in the Art Institute of Chicago, painted in 1880. It's been called lots of things through its history. It's called now called The Two Pots. And it's a painting which is very clearly something which has a non-visual association. And you see here, you think, why in the world, if you were going to paint a still life, would you put this and this in the middle of a table in this kind of dumb arrangement and just paint them? I mean, there's nothing attractive about their relationship to it. So he's clearly thinking about something. And when you read Gauguin, when you read his imagination a little bit further, you find yourself going into La Fontaine and Aesop, the fabulous, the writers of fables, which he read his children. He was still married when he had this painting. And there is a famous fable called Le pot de terre et le pot de fer, the pot of clay and the pot of iron. And the story of the fable is that their two pots are sitting around a fireplace, and the pot of iron says to the pot of clay, "It's really boring being here, let's go on a trip." And so the pot of clay says, "Oh, I can't go on a trip, I might break." And the pot of iron says, "Oh, well, don't worry, I'll protect you, I'll guarantee that you won't break, let's go on a trip." And so they get strapped onto the ass of the owner. Not the ass of the owner, the donkey of the owner, sorry. They go off into the future, and what happens? The clay pot falls off and breaks. And the moral of the story is know thine own nature. And this is a painting that was painted just as his marriage was beginning to dissolve. And this pot, the iron pot, comes from Gauguin's family, and this pot comes from the family of his wife. And he's using fables and objects to do what really is essentially a portrait of a marriage, a kind of deeply psychological work of art, where the depth of meaning in it is not to be found on the surface. This is not an Impressionist still life, and it was in an Impressionist exhibition. Or this, where the pot is reused with a sleeping child next to it and these wonderful galumphing geese on the wall, as if in the dreams of the child who is down below, the pot is closed and the head of the child is closed, but the child dreams and we can imagine what goes on in them. Or this, the same pot, which is finally taken to Denmark, where this picture is painted in 1885. This is one of the great early Gauguins in private hands. So Timothy, watch out, because maybe it'll come up, because it's really amazing. It's about death. You see the dead pigeons, both real and illusory. You see the onions, which have come from the earth. You see this pot. You see this odd flaming picture. You see a bed with people surrounding it in the background. And you see this picture which has to do with genre and still life, and which evokes death. So the evocation of death in still life, the evocation of meanings beyond the meanings of the objects in the still life, is something which is in Gauguin from the very beginning of his career. Or this, a picture which was always rejected as not being by Gauguin, but is in fact one of the very few works by Gauguin painted in the pointillist style, the style of Seurat, which he despised. He worked on it for a while, and in this wonderful head, which is a plaster cast of the head in the Parthenon frieze, which was in London at the time, and which he owned, this plaster head. Reproductions of works of art. We have East and West meeting together in a still life which could be by no other artist than Gauguin. And we look at this, and indeed this still life looks as if it belongs in a tradition of paintings by Gauguin. But the painting that's the most like it, and the most tragically like it, and the most interestingly like it is this one, which is actually in the Museum of Western Art in Tehran. So you have to go there to see it rather than just Cairo. It's now on show. The museum has been reopened. and it's on show, and it has a severed head in it with flowers coming out of it, a Japanese print, a huge, ungainly, weird vase with a series of effulgent flowers, and a group of leaves down below with its aggressive signature and date. This is Gauguin's self-portrait. It is a self-portrait vase made early in 1889, just after he left Van Gogh in Arles on Christmas Day of 1888, and just after he witnessed 3 days later, on the 28th of December, a public execution in Paris where the guillotine failed to work properly. So Gauguin begins to do these bizarre ceramic heads, which of course have their roots in Peruvian pre-Columbian art from the past of his childhood. He grew up in Lima, Peru. As an infant, had known these moche pots in the shape of heads. This one, which is even more interesting because, of course, it comes after the whole accident with Van Gogh. And what does this image not have? Ears. And the eyes are closed. And the features are unmistakably those of Gauguin, and he used it as a flower vase. And this one, which is even more amazing, this is a tobacco jar about this big, made in 2 parts, very early in 1889 at the same point. And he writes to his friend Bernard about it. The character of stoneware is that of a very hot fire. And this figure, which has been scorched in the fires of hell, is, I think, a strong impression of that character. Like an artist glimpsed by Dante on his tour of the Inferno, a poor devil all doubled up to endure his pain. And in another letter, he says that this is me, this is a self-portrait, and I have put myself into the kiln. So the notion of this head, and this head and body being incinerated and being thrust through hell and being put into a kind of position in the mind which is so deeply troubled makes our Getty still life seem less terrifying indeed. And here one sees Gauguin again in a relief later in that year, made in September of 1889, in which he reappears with his thumb in his mouth as a kind of infantile adult. And one sees this in the last great self-portrait he painted before he goes to Tahiti, where he links himself with the Yellow Christ in Buffalo, where he looks at us here, and where this object is behind him on the other side. Or his fascination with death in this picture, which is a drawing in the collection of the Louvre. If you were shown this on your orals and you didn't guess that it was by Gauguin, you would pass, because it doesn't look like a Gauguin, but it in fact is by Gauguin. And it's in fact an illustration for the program of a play that was performed in 1889 and 1890. In fact, in 1890, before he goes to Tahiti. And it's a play called Madame la Morte, Drame Cérébral, a cerebral drama of Madame Death. And this idea of thinking about, of having death in the front of his mind, and then confronting the death of Pomaré V right when he gets to Tahiti, and thinking about the effects of that death upon Tahiti is something which is very powerful. Here we see again an image which is, I hope, as I show it repeatedly, is beginning to look less and less terrifying and more beautiful in a way which is almost pathetic and very strong. Now, it's the third of the major still lifes painted in Tahiti. And it's the oddest of them, but it's not the only oddity. This is the first one, called Les Fleurs de France, the flowers of France. And it shows a Tahitian couple in an interior which is completely European. They're wearing European clothes with a belt and pants and a sort of t-shirt, and atop there's a table of European construction and origin. And the flowers on the table, I'm sure you can recognize them in California, are oleanders. And of course, what happens when you eat oleanders? You die. So Gauguin is painting flowers imported from Europe to the tropics, planted in French gardens, which he knew were poisonous. And therefore, the meaning of this picture, which seems so simple when you first look at it, becomes more complex. Or here, a painting on paper. This is in the Louvre, or the Musée d'Orsay. It's a painting on paper, pasted onto canvas. It started out as a big drawing. And it has these still life elements with this very strong knife, and then these three figures who have such an odd relationship with each other and what they're doing and what the meal is about and what's about to happen. There's a sense of some kind of rite which even the figures in the painting don't understand. And then in 1892, this still life. When we look at Gauguin's paintings in Tahiti, we think of them generally, and oftentimes when you see exhibitions of them, you think of them as these sort of transcriptions of life in Tahiti. But they're anything but. You know, these two pictures are in the Guggenheim Museum, painted in the first year. These two pigs, of course, pigs are European, not Polynesian, oinking around down below this bizarre tree, which looks like a pattern. This is Dans la Vanille in the vanilla groves, and you see a Tahitian man and a Tahitian horse that come right from the Parthenon frieze. So even when he's seeing Polynesians, he's bringing European art to bear. He is as guilty as the merchants and the bureaucrats in Papeete. Or here, painting Ave Maria, Ierana Maria, the painting that was also referred to in that first review of 1892. One sees a Polynesian Christ and a Polynesian Mary being worshipped by two women who come right out of the friezes of Borobudur, the great Buddhist friezes of Borobudur. And this is a photograph of Borobudur owned by Gauguin. And this is another relief which Gauguin, we don't know whether he owned a photograph of it or whether he was there. And these figures come from Borobudur, the strange angel dancing in the background, the still life with bananas that responds to the still life that we just saw before. And there's a sense of the Protestant missionaries being in Tahiti, teaching them Christianity, and the sense of the infecting of the people of Tahiti by European religion and ideas is very important to Gauguin's first career. This is the most expensive painting sold until last week, and it's a Gauguin that was sold for $200 million to the royal family of Qatar. And it's a picture it looks so simple and so elegant and so wonderful, and the title of it is When Will You Marry? So Gauguin's one of the first artists in the history of Western art who entitles his pictures with questions. And then, of course, the concept of marriage is a concept that has no meaning in Polynesia. It's a European concept. And so the struggle, the idea of the older woman and the younger woman, the woman in the missionary dress and the woman in Polynesian clothes, thinking about marriage is something that is not so different in many ways from this or here, when one sees this extraordinary young woman lying face down with the figure of death, and it's an inversion of Manet's Olympia. And not only is it an inversion of Manet's Olympia, but this is Gauguin's copy of Manet's Olympia, painted within months before his departure to Tahiti. So he's even thinking about Manet and Manet's form of beauty with the French African maid and the figure of death who's dark, with the white woman who's face up and looking at us with the black woman who's looking at us in terror on the other side. And this inversion is something which is essential to the meaning of the picture. Or the idea that guilt too is in paradise, and that the Western concept of paradise is infused into the Tahiti that he knows. This is his mistress as Eve. This is his mom as Eve, in a work of art painted before he goes to Tahiti in 1890. This was painted in 1892. And here is the source of the figure, which is a bodhisattva from Borobudur. So one has this kind of strange world in which he cannot see Tahiti except through the lens of others. We see Eve before the fall and Eve after the fall in the paintings in Kirishiki and Washington. We see a group of women at the market in Tahiti as if taken from an Egyptian frieze. We see this reconstruction of a world which Gauguin never saw, with an idol that was gone and absent from Tahiti, being worshipped by people who could not be observed in reality anymore, a Arii or a hilltop temple of the Tahitians, and you can recognize that same ear spool that you saw before being the source for this fretwork of the French with skulls lining it, not so different indeed from your severed head. Or these, the gods of the Tahitians, which he himself had to fashion because there were no more left. Or this, the ancestors of Tahiti. This is his beautiful wife, whose name, or mistress, I guess we should formally say, because of course they never married, and her name was Tuhura, not Tahiti. And he says, here is the title of the picture, here with her title, Tahiti, which comes from Pierre Loti. And we see her with her, the title of the picture is Tahiti has many parents. The notion being that marriage doesn't exist, that there's a birth mother, that the father is not necessarily known, that there are many people who take care of babies, that the world of ancestors is huge, and that the world of ancestors is unknown to Tahiti, because neither Tahiti nor Gauguin could read these words, and neither of them had ever seen an idol of Hina, which one sees here. And here is the source for these letters, which are the Easter Island tablets, which remain to this day untranslated, and which were a deep source of mystery to Gauguin. And here are Gauguin's fashionings of the appearance as idols of Hina. So Gauguin has to himself find the ancestors of Tahiti, this woman who's to teach him about the spirit of the ancients that have been lost. This extraordinary head begins to take on meanings, many meanings, most of them very much about loss, and the idea of not just loss of life, but loss of civilization is what's extraordinarily important in looking at these. It is the decor of this picture looks forward to the next great decor of the painting Nevermore of 1897, which is in the Courtauld Institute. And what's interesting is that the painting begins to make its appearances in text by Gauguin. This is Gauguin's first text, which is called Cahier pour Aline, Notebook for Aline, my daughter. Here are the ends of this is the back of the book, and this is the front of the book, with two of his heroes, Corot and Delacroix, with these fold-over things where you can play with them, and a text which actually has maxims about beauty for his daughter. And I'm just going to read you a few of them. What do you prefer, he asks her, a stunning painting of an unattractive person or a hideous painting of a beautiful person? A sincere painter, he writes a few pages later, will always experience a certain amount of anxiety when borrowing beautiful elements from another. And Gauguin was a borrower. It is not, however, his subject that must be beautiful, but his manner of painting it. So the idea of the ugly subject becoming beautiful in the hands of an artist recurs in two of these maxims. And then most chillingly, once at the guillotine, the person awaiting execution must place his neck in exactly the right place on the scaffold, which does not happen very often, because the condemned is either too big or too small. Why can't the board be adjusted to accommodate a specific size ahead of time, which would make the whole ordeal so much simpler? This, of course, comes from his witnessing a beheading that went wrong. And these stories and images play so strongly in Gauguin's mind. And Noa Noa, his greatest text, in Ancien Culte Marie, this text written largely in France after his trip, and which the Getty owns the first draft of it in Gauguin's hand, which has been extensively published. This is the real or larger version, which was a collaboration between Gauguin and Charles Maurice, which is in the Louvre and which has never been published. It's never been published except in facsimile, so no one reads it. And what I'm going to do now is to end the lecture. These are pages from Noa Noa, and they show you why we look at Noa Noa. We look at the pages that look like this in Noa Noa, and we don't read the text. I want you to look at this, and I'm going to read you part of a longish poem, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, don't worry, which was included by Gauguin towards the end of his manuscript. And it's a poem on which he worked enormously, and there are several drafts of it that went back and forth between himself and his collaborator. It was even read in draft by Mallarmé, who he looked at earlier. And so Gauguin's desire to express things in poetic form is something which he shared with amongst the greatest writers of his periods. And I want you to look at this painting as I read the excerpts from this long poem in English, don't worry. The gods are dead, Tahiti dying with them. The sun long ago giving life now calms it. Its dead sleep only brings brief visions of hope. The tree of lament appears in Eve's dream. She wonders then, looking down, she beams, but fruitless she remains, sealed by divine sins. The gods are dead, but on its chariot of gloom, crimson with flowers and love and famous for doom, the night appears chasing the furious sun, and from their graves the gods loom, who on the peak in a secret summit throughout the night remain static, stretching their arms out to the endless sea. And from the crown to the water, slow and easy, demons and specters from the South Seas, spirits of the dead, ferociously hungry, and in the small hut, while flapping their wings towards the bed, where the fearful does not rest, they slip in, cold and creeping, whispering at best. It is the hour of gods, the night of gods, twilight. Come, you must serve them. It is you they've elected. It is the night of death and love, not day. Come, you must serve them. It is you they crave. No longer will you play on the edge of the sea or sing your hymn beneath the rose leaves, nor fuse your gold with the sea's treasure or bathe your dreams in its waves of pleasure. Come, it is you the dead gods have chosen. It is you the dead gods have chosen in the temple where the nude bathes. Come with the candor of your youth wide open and the pride of your beauty laid bare. You cannot escape the devotion of gods. They will seize you precisely for your charm. Vairamati is your name, the lover of gods, or else, despite your tears, you become their prey. It is the hour of gods, the night of gods, twilight. Come, you must serve them. It is you they've elected. It is the night of death and love, not day. Come, you must love them. It is you they crave. And in terror, the child sees the ancient sanctuary. this temple of rituals, this mortuary where the dreadful gods have their sacred utterance, reach their bloody arms up to the ravaged sky, and their generous race, which slowly yields under the weight of regret, oppressed by the grave, and where await those gods which she forgot in this place. On the dreadful summit of this happy islet, there resides the temple, wide open space, solemn, frightful, and barren. Thank you.
Rick has agreed to take some questions, and we'll just wait for the chairs to come out and some microphones. Well, that was wonderful. Thank you so much for a fascinating look at a...
I have to practice my reading. I didn't read very well. I apologize. I'll read better the next time. Yeah.
No, I think I'll never look at the picture again without thinking through all of these permutations. I mean, it's fascinating how you can deconstruct these pictures, and it struck me in looking at our picture and several of the still lives that you showed, as well as many of his compositions. Gauguin seems to have this habit of creating his compositions through a great leap into space. And it made me think, especially with our picture, it made me think of the technique that Velázquez uses in his bodegones, where he'll have the still life in the foreground, and then way in the background, small figures which comment on the foreground. And he does it here, he does it in many of his pictures.
But this picture, the head is so strong that it takes a while to look beyond it. And it's the beyond it that's really interesting, the relationship of the beyond it to the head,
But I wonder if you could comment on that compositional technique, because he does seem to use it throughout his and it's rather unusual for someone of his generation.
Well, I it's true what you say, even though there are as many pictures that don't do that, that do that. So it's not always the same. But the idea of the juxtaposition of a strong element in the foreground that you can touch, and this notion of tactility, of wanting something that you can grab and then juxtaposed to something that you merely see, it fascinated him.
Because it's another kind of inversion where the figures, normally what we would think of as the most important element in the composition, are
in the back,
way in the back.
Yeah, or there are so many of them that you don't know. There's one actually delicious early still life by Gauguin. I would have loved to have given a whole lecture on Gauguin still lifes, but I didn't. You were lucky. But the first really important one, which is in the Virginia Museum, looks for all the world like a Manet. I mean, he's trying to be Manet in the mid-1870s. And what's interesting about it is you all know the trope of having the knife in the corner of the picture with that knife handle within easy grasp of the viewer. So you're supposed to think of yourself as cutting something or eating something or getting involved with your hand in the picture. And what Gauguin does is he turns the knife around so that it's the blade that's in the front. And it's so Gauguin. I mean, at least I hope that I convince you that Gauguin is deeply weird, even when he doesn't look like he is. Are there questions?
Yes. Please wait for the microphone just so we can all hear things.
Can you comment on the meaning and purpose of decapitation of dead royal figures who die of natural causes versus decapitation of criminals in Western tradition?
One doesn't know how much Gauguin knew about ritual decapitation except for having seen the heads. And that doesn't mean that you know anything. That just means you've seen the heads. Gauguin was really, really interested in cannibalism. I mean, like really interested in cannibalism, and wrote about it and was interested in where it still persisted. But that's a different kind of thing. And I don't know, this picture is really a one-off. There's one, I tried to find a photograph of it today and I couldn't on the web. One of the most bizarre early works by Gauguin is a decapitated head of one of his children, which he made in wax early on his career, and which Anna Brigitte Fonsmark, my friend who's a specialist in Gauguin sculpture, found as a doorstop in a house and it's like really bizarre. And it's a sleeping baby that's only a head. It has no body whatsoever, and it's beautifully modeled in wax. And it's done in 1879. It's done early, and so the sense of the head and the decapitated head is something that was with him quite early on.
Up at the top.
The Gauguin painting, Are You Jealous? Does that belong to these themes?
Yeah, I mean, there are a whole group of paintings that ask questions in them, and they're very interesting. You know, what's interesting is that some of them have question marks and others of them don't. Others of them, the question is implied in the way that he titles them in Tahitian, which means that no French person or no American could tell whether it's a question. But this idea that a painting interrogates the viewer rather than the viewer interrogates the painting. It's sort of like Olympia staring at you. You know, you're not staring at her, she's staring at you. And Gauguin's paintings interrogate the viewer. They make us think, ask questions. And what's interesting, that's why I started with the Opa Opa Schnecklud, to show really how many layers something that's really quite visually simple can have. And if something that's that visually simple can have that many layers that you can demonstrate very clearly, imagine what it's like when you deal with really complicated paintings by Gauguin. And Arii Matamoe is not a particularly complicated painting. You have to get into the later paintings to get really things that require almost a book to explain them or to come to terms with their diverse meanings.
How are you going to finish the catalog raisonné if every entry has to have this kind of deconstruction?
Well, every
peeling
entry
away?
doesn't. What's interesting about doing a catalog raisonné is that since the paintings talk to each other, you can do things in one entry and then refer to them in others. So and I decided that I don't want to have 25-page entries. I mean, even my entry for Du Vin au Nu is only like 15 pages long, which, given what's been written about it, is ridiculous. So I actually want to finish the catalog raisonné.
Yeah, Scott?
You all should, Scott, who is sitting here, wrote the most brilliant essay on this painting. And so it's, practically everything that I say comes from his essay, so it's embarrassing that he's here.
It's embarrassing to me that you just said that, because I thought that was brilliant, and thank you for that. I have a pretty simple question. Given that Gauguin was so invested in, sort of shrouding his works in mystery and, presenting himself and his art to, a French public from this position of cultural alterity that he sort of fantasizes for himself, why provide a French translation for the title? And is that something
I think it's because the Durand-Well brothers insisted.
Oh, okay.
And it's also why he wrote the books. I mean, he wrote Noa Noa so that people could have some way into the paintings. And Noa Noa was, of course, written in French, not in Polynesian. So, and though the titles of the paintings he discusses in Noa Noa are in Polynesian, so you can use it as a sort of guide. He was very upset, actually, by the fact that the paintings were so incomprehensible to viewers. Though what's interesting is that his first book, Cahiers pour Aline, which he wrote for his daughter, and it turns out she died before he could ever give it to her. So it was a kind of tragic book, and it's one of the most wonderful books because how many fathers write a book to their 16-year-old daughter? The idea of it was it was for her birthday when she was to become a woman, and it has very frank discussions about sexuality and marriage and men and homosexuality and morality and religion. It's like no parent today would speak with the frankness that Gauguin did to his daughter. Maybe thank God she died. I think that he was shocked by how poorly he was understood. And he wanted the paintings to be thought of as the brilliant step forward that they were. They were for him. And, you know, if one of the things about Gauguin is that, like lots of blunderbusses, he was deeply insecure, but always professing a sense of his own genius. And it's one of the reasons why you sort of hate him when you read him, is because he's so full of himself. And of course, he was like terminally insecure. Down deep, and it's why he needed to explain himself in so many ways, and also to hide so persistently from meaning, from clarity. That doesn't answer your question, but
No, it doesn't. And just as a quick follow-up, I mean, this, you know, the specificity of La Fin Royale.
yeah,
This is 1893 in Paris, the 100-year anniversary of.
yeah,
1793 and the decapitation of Louis XVI.
yeah.
And I mean, is that something that's on his mind and something that's
I don't
in
think
people's
so.
mind? No.
I don't think. Well, I mean, Gauguin thought that aristocracy was preferable to democracy, and he said that in several different ways and several times in his life, and thought of himself as, you know, descending. He had these sort of fictitious ideas of his own identity, and so it is possible that he thought that, but there's no evidence that he did. Back.
Thank you so much. Question, when Gauguin came back to Paris after his first sojourn overseas, I have read two things, that he really wanted to stay, and had the show gone better, he might have. What do you think? Did he always intend to go back?
No. I mean, at the beginning, he wanted to come back and in triumph and, you know, make money and do well and be successful, and that didn't happen. And the sale before he leaves in 1895, in which this painting was bought in, was such a disaster for him, and such an economic disaster, that he could barely afford to move back. He inherited a bunch of money when he got back, and he went through it like being Gauguin. He went through it very quickly. And I think it became clear to him that his way of living and his way of thinking about both religion and the relationship between the sexes and family life was incompatible with European life, that he needed to go once more to Tahiti. But as you all know, the works from his second trip are obsessed with Western and Eastern religion. They're really not about Tahiti. They're about the world. I mean, Gauguin was the first global artist. He really was. He was the first artist who attempted to deal with virtually every known religious tradition, with sources of imagery from every source, from Hindu and Buddhist philosophy. He was deeply informed about Christianity. His book on Christianity and Catholicism and the modern consciousness, which is unpublished, and the manuscript of it is in the St. Louis Art Museum, is one of the most brilliant books about religion ever written by an artist. And Gauguin knew his comparative religion, and he really knew his Bible. Gauguin could probably recite the Old and New Testament without prompting. His knowledge of the Bible was so great. And you don't think about this when you think about him, but when you actually read the books and you see the way he phrases things in his sources, they're so complicated and they're so interesting and they're so deeply intellectual. I mean, he was very well read, and his knowledge of the history of art was profound. I mean, he knew secondary and tertiary artists. He had been to weird museums. He had a visual memory. He writes at the end of his life about his memory of images, his visual memory, and which we know actually was extraordinary, because one knows that he makes images that refer very strongly to something that he hadn't seen for 20 years and couldn't have seen and couldn't have owned a photograph of. So the sense that he can remember even particular qualities of visual form mean that his visual imagination and memory were prodigious. He was one of the great geniuses of the last century, without 2 centuries. He was and we don't know how brilliant he was, and it's largely because we don't read him. And it's reading him that provides this other dimension much more fully, because in the end, most of us are more verbal than we are visual.
Hi, thanks for a great talk. You gave such a convincing account of the system of personal citations and references throughout the painting, and you made a case for the originality of the priest and those two figures in the background. I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about the originality of those two figures with respect to this system of citation. I mean,
Which two figures?
The figures in the background, the priest, the kind of
they come from Gauguin owned a catalog of the death sale of his guardian, whose name was Gustavo Rosa, and the Getty, of course, owns everything, and they, of course, own one of the copies of the catalog, so you can all go to the GRI and look at it. But he owned, I think, 20 works by Delacroix, and those two figures come from Delacroix, and he literally borrows them and pastes them in to his own work with completely different meanings than, and I don't know that he even knew what the figures in the Delacroix meant. He was attracted to them because there was a hooded figure and a non-hooded figure who were shown in profile moving. And it was those, and they appear many more times. I mean, it would have been possible to give a whole lecture about those two figures. He only writes about them twice. And in both cases, he writes about them as whispering to each other. And so it's, you can't hear what they're saying. And they're in the middle ground and they're commenting. They're right behind the Tree of Knowledge in the painting, the first painting that I showed of them. That's as far as I can go in an answer.
I guess I'm just asking, how are we to read those two figures with respect to this space of kind of internal coherence and reference?
Well, they're outside. They're in their own world. One of the things that I don't understand about the outside is the yellow sky. And I'm fascinated by that, and I really don't get it, because he doesn't do that. I mean, he makes water into all these weird colors, but not the sky. And I was looking at the painting this afternoon in the conservation studio and realizing that part of the picture is so much stronger when you look at the picture than it is when you look at a photograph of the picture. And that's when the painting goes up, you all have to go rush to see it, because it really is beautiful, and it takes a long time to see. I mean, one little bit of advice from me, who spent the last 30 years looking at Gauguin, is that you have to look at them for a long time. You cannot look at them quickly. They don't work if you look at them quickly. Nor do they work when you look at them slowly. But you get more out of it.
First, when you're referring to his writing, has it been translated into English?
There are two texts that have been translated. One is his last book called Avant et Après, which was translated in the 1920s by Van Wyck Brooks very badly, and it has several titles in English. I'm trying to think of the most famous one, Notes of a Savage. And it's a kind of, this is my life. He writes it right before he dies. And Gauguin, like Manet, knew that he was dying. So it's a book that really is a kind of my life flashing before me as I die book. And it's wonderful. And then the Getty, Noah Noah, the first draft of Noah Noah, before he began to collaborate with other writers, is also published in English in a book on Noah Noah by Nicholas Wadley. And none of the other texts are translated or even available in print. They're only available in facsimiles, so people don't read them. One of my goals in life is to publish a French and English dual version of all of the 6 texts of Gauguin from 1893 to 1902.
So if I were to check if the libraries would have any of this, I would
Van Wyck's Brook, or you can do Gauguin,
That's what I was going to say. Yeah.
Notes of a Savage, and Van Wyck's Brook, Noah Noah.
But but it would, I could look up the author as Gauguin
Yeah,
for both of them.
yeah. And the Getty owns all the facsimiles. So you could see the facsimile of Noa Noa. You can see the facsimile of Kaye Paraline. You can see the facsimile of Ancien Colt Maori, and you can see the facsimile of Avant et Après. So the facsimiles are all in the Getty Library.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe one last question before we wrap it up. Up there in the center.
I promise my lecture on Thursday won't be as long.
Well, this is a very simple question,
Okay.
I think. You referred to an ear spool.
Ear spool, yeah.
What is that?
It's you disengage the circular part from the other part, and you put it through. It's an earring in a pierced ear. That's what it is.
All right,
All right.
Let's gonna end on something.
On a positive note, what is an ear spool?
Could you use the term when you were showing us some of the figures that were based on classical prototypes from the Parthenon frieze, etc., and you referred to these Tahitian figures being infected, I think was the term you used, by classical European culture. Is there another way to look at it? Could we look at it as
glorifying
and glorifying a culture that is hasn't been over civilized?
There's also there is this enormous sense of loss that Gauguin feels throughout his time in Polynesia, and he expresses that by bringing to bear upon Polynesian culture that which he knows from other cultures. And it is a form of infecting. I mean, it's not because he can't find what's authentic. It's not possible to find what's authentic. And I find them really almost, tragic, the works of art. His uncle, who was a great collector, also was a major photographer of works of art. And he published the first published photographs of the Parthenon frieze. And Gauguin owned all of them. And you find the Parthenon frieze all over the Tahitian works. You could do almost a book on Gauguin, the Parthenon frieze. He also owned photographs of Trajan's column, and they're sources from Trajan's column. So, and he owned photographs of Egyptian reliefs, and it's generally other ancient cultures that he applies to Tahitian culture, not contemporary or European Old Master culture. So it is positive. Anyway, thank you very much for your attention. So.